My grandson came home from school one afternoon and asked me, with the particular bluntness only a 12-year-old manages, why I'd never told him I used to fly airplanes and shoot at people. I set down the coffee cup I was holding and asked him where on earth he'd heard something like that. He told me his history teacher had shown the whole class a photograph that afternoon and that I was standing right in the middle of it. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Edward Marsh, United States Air Force, retired. I was 68 years old the day my own grandson learned about my combat career from a classroom projector screen rather than from me, and I sat there at my kitchen table trying to decide how I felt about it, landing somewhere between embarrassed and oddly relieved that the truth had finally found its own way into the open. I need to explain how a grandfather ends up in this position, keeping something this significant quiet for so long that a stranger has to reveal it first. I flew fighter aircraft for the Air Force for 18 years, including 2 combat deployments during periods I don't discuss in specific detail with most people, not because any of it remains classified at this point, but because the particulars of aerial combat aren't the kind of dinner table conversation I ever felt comfortable initiating, especially not with children in the room. I completed 63 combat missions across those 2 deployments, came home each time with the aircraft and myself reasonably intact, and spent the remainder of my career training younger pilots before retiring as a lieutenant colonel after 18 years of service.
There's a particular kind of compartmentalization that fighter pilots of my era learned, whether we meant to or not, a mental discipline built out of necessity for the job itself, where you had to be able to fully focus on a mission while it was happening, and then, ideally, set it aside completely once you were back on the ground, because carrying that intensity into every waking moment simply wasn't sustainable over a career. I got very good at that compartmentalization during my active years, and I think, without ever consciously deciding to, I eventually applied that same skill to my family life as well, sealing those years into their own separate compartment and rarely opening it, even decades after I'd stopped needing to for any operational reason. I married my wife, Susan, during my 2nd year of flight training, and we raised 2 children together, my son, David, and my daughter, Michelle, largely without me discussing the specifics of my combat experience at home. This wasn't a deliberate strategy so much as a habit that simply calcified over the decades. Susan knew the broad outlines, obviously, but even she would tell you I rarely elaborated beyond what was strictly necessary. I came home from each deployment, resumed civilian family routines as quickly as I could manage, and treated my combat years less like a story to be told and more like a chapter I'd simply closed and set aside. David grew up, eventually had his own son, my grandson, Tyler, and the pattern of quiet omission continued into this next generation almost without my noticing it happening. Tyler knew, in the vague way children often know things about grandparents, that I'd been in the Air Force, the same unremarkable phrase that could describe virtually anyone who'd worn the uniform for any length of time. He knew I sometimes still stood up a little straighter than seemed necessary, that I occasionally used phrases that sounded slightly military, that I kept a small case of old medals somewhere in a closet he'd never actually seen opened. Beyond that, my combat service was, to him, simply an unexamined fact of family background, the same way most 12-year-olds understand that a grandparent did something for a career without any real curiosity about the specifics.
I want to be honest that some part of this suited me fine. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from being, within your own family, simply grandpa, rather than a walking repository of difficult memories that people feel obligated to ask careful questions about. I'd watched other veterans I served with become, within their own families, defined almost entirely by their service, every gathering eventually circling back to war stories, whether anyone specifically wanted to hear them or not. I never wanted that dynamic in my own house. I wanted to be the grandfather who taught Tyler to fish and helped him build model airplanes, not a living museum exhibit people felt they had to carefully navigate around. What I hadn't fully considered until that afternoon at the kitchen table was that my careful, protective silence had also meant Tyler was growing up without any real understanding of a significant part of who his grandfather actually was. The specifics of how this all came out involved a history teacher, Mr. Alvarez, who Tyler had mentioned enthusiastically several times over the school year, a teacher clearly gifted at making history feel immediate and relevant rather than abstract and distant. Mr. Alvarez, as I would learn, had built a unit specifically around the concept of hidden histories, encouraging students to research family members' service records or historical involvement they might not know much about, as a way of making broader historical events feel personally connected rather than purely academic. Tyler, apparently, had mentioned to Mr. Alvarez in passing weeks earlier that his grandfather had been in the Air Force, without any further elaboration because he genuinely had none to offer. Mr. Alvarez, it turned out, had a personal interest in aviation history and asked Tyler, almost as an aside, whether he knew which unit I'd served with. Information Tyler didn't have, but offered to find out by asking Susan, since I wasn't home the particular evening this conversation happened.
Susan, without thinking much of it, mentioned my old squadron designation, information she knew simply because she'd typed it onto official paperwork more times than she could count over the decades of my career. Tyler passed this along to Mr. Alvarez the next day, likely not expecting it to lead anywhere significant. What neither Tyler nor Susan realized was that Mr. Alvarez maintained a personal collection of historical squadron photographs and records, an actual hobby of his connected to his broader interest in military aviation history, something he'd built up over years independent of his teaching career. When he heard my old squadron's designation, he went home that evening and searched through his own archive and found, among his collection, an official squadron photograph from one of my deployments, a group photo of pilots standing in front of an aircraft, my own younger face clearly visible among roughly 20 other young men. Mr. Alvarez brought that photograph to class the next day, genuinely excited to show Tyler what he'd found, likely expecting a moment of pleasant surprise rather than the more complicated reaction that actually followed. He projected the image for the whole class, pointed out my face specifically, and began explaining, with the kind of enthusiasm history teachers bring to genuine discoveries, some of the context around that particular deployment period, information he'd gathered from his own broader research into that era of the conflict. According to Tyler, several of his classmates turned to look at him with a kind of surprised curiosity, a few asking, right there in the middle of class, whether that was really his grandfather, whether I was like a war hero or something. Tyler told me later that he hadn't known how to answer any of those questions in the moment, caught completely off guard in front of 30 of his peers by information about his own family that he was hearing for the very first time, projected 12 feet wide on a classroom screen. Tyler sat in that classroom watching his classmates look at a photograph of his grandfather as a young combat pilot, absorbing details about combat missions and deployment periods that I had simply never discussed with him, learning the outline of a significant chapter of my life from a teacher's personal hobby collection rather than from any conversation we'd ever had ourselves. He came home that afternoon with a mixture of excitement and something more complicated underneath it, the beginning of a question he clearly wasn't sure how to fully articulate yet, which eventually came out as that blunt 12-year-old directness about airplanes and shooting at people. I sat with him at the kitchen table for a long time that afternoon, trying to figure out how to answer honestly without overwhelming a 12-year-old with details he wasn't ready to fully process. I told him some of the basic truth that, yes, I had flown combat missions, that it had been a difficult and serious part of my life, and that I hadn't talked about it much over the years, not because it was some kind of secret exactly, but because I'd never quite figured out how to bring it up in a way that felt appropriate for family conversation.
He asked me a series of questions in that particular rapid-fire way children process new information, whether I'd ever been scared, whether I'd known any of the men in the photograph well, whether any of them hadn't come home. I answered what I could answer honestly at a level appropriate for his age, and told him, gently, that some parts of it I still wasn't ready to talk about in detail, even with him, and that I hoped he could understand that some things take longer than others to become easier to discuss, even decades later.
Tyler asked me, with an earnestness that caught me somewhat off guard, why I hadn't just told him myself, especially once he was old enough to maybe handle hearing about it. I gave him the most honest answer I could manage in the moment, which was that I genuinely wasn't sure, that some habits of silence get built for good reasons at the time and then simply outlive their original purpose, calcifying into something closer to avoidance than protection. David, my son, came by that evening once Susan called him to explain what had happened at school, and the three of us, David, Tyler, and myself, ended up having a longer conversation than I think any of us expected, spread out at the kitchen table with old photographs Susan eventually pulled down from a closet shelf, images and mementos that had sat largely undisturbed for years. David, I realized during that conversation, had his own version of the same gap Tyler had just discovered, having grown up with roughly the same vague outline of my service that he'd apparently passed down to his own son without ever fully examining it himself. He admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he'd simply never pushed very hard for details growing up, partly out of respect for what he'd sensed was a closed subject, partly because as a kid himself, the idea of his father in combat had felt too big and frightening to want to understand in detail. Watching his own son learn the outline of my service from a classroom projector had apparently forced David to confront how incomplete his own understanding still was, well into his 40s. I told them some of what I'd never fully articulated before, not everything, some details I still keep to myself even now, but enough that both David and Tyler left that evening with a considerably fuller understanding of who I actually was during those 18 years of service, rather than the vague, comfortable outline they'd both apparently carried without realizing how incomplete it was. Mr. Alvarez reached out to me directly about a week later, apologetic in a way I didn't think was fully necessary, worried that he'd overstepped by sharing something so personal without checking with the family first. I told him honestly that he'd done nothing wrong, that his genuine enthusiasm for history had simply exposed a gap in my own family that had existed for a long time before he ever walked into that classroom, and that if anything, I owed him some gratitude for finally prompting a conversation I probably should have initiated myself years earlier. I ended up visiting Tyler's class about a month later, at both his and Mr. Alvarez's invitation, answering a room full of 12-year-olds' questions about my service, in a format that felt considerably easier than the more personal, weighted conversation at my own kitchen table. There's something almost freeing about explaining difficult history to a room of curious strangers, rather than to the people whose opinion of you actually matters most. Tyler, in the weeks since, has started asking me questions regularly. Not overwhelming or constant, just the natural curiosity of a boy who finally understands there's more to his grandfather than fishing trips and model airplanes. I've started answering more of them than I used to, slowly, at my own pace, sharing pieces of those 18 years that I'd kept quietly folded away from most of his life. We even started a few weeks ago, going through Susan's closet box together properly. Tyler asking about specific photographs, me finally attaching names and stories to faces that had sat unexplained in that box for longer than he'd been alive. If you've ever kept something significant about yourself quiet for so long that the people you love learned it from someone else entirely, I hope you hear this. Protecting the people you love from difficult truths sometimes shades, without you quite noticing when it happens, into simply keeping yourself hidden from them. The truth usually finds its way out eventually, one way or another, and it's worth asking yourself whether you'd rather be the one who finally tells it or the one who gets caught by surprise when someone else does it for you.